There is a gesture in the Gospel of John that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. It lasts only a few seconds in the narrative. It is never explained. The text records it, moves past it, and leaves every reader in history to wonder what exactly was being written in the dirt of a Jerusalem courtyard on an ordinary morning. Almost every answer that has been offered over the centuries treats it as a mystery that cannot be solved. A dramatic pause, a moment of silence given physical form, Jesus buying time while he thinks. That last interpretation is perhaps the most condescending. The idea that the one who, according to every account, spoke with an authority that left crowds breathless, needed to doodle in the dust while formulating a response. There is a better answer, and it was hiding in plain sight inside a text that the men standing in that courtyard would have known by memory. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the scene actually was. A woman had been caught in adultery. The text specifies caught in the act, which means witnesses were present, which means this was not a private accusation, but a formal legal situation. She is brought before Jesus in the temple courts, and the men who bring her are not primarily interested in her. They are interested in him. The text is explicit about this. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. That last phrase, write on the ground with his finger, is the detail that almost no one reads carefully enough, because the word translated as write is the Greek word katagraphein, which does not simply mean to write letters or words. It carries the specific connotation of writing down a record against someone, a charge, an indictment. The word appears in legal contexts throughout ancient Greek literature to describe the act of formally registering an accusation. John chose this word deliberately. Jesus is not sketching in the dirt. He is writing something that functions, in its form, as an accusation. But an accusation of what? And against whom? This is where the text underneath the text becomes visible. Because 7 centuries before this courtyard scene, a prophet had written something that the Pharisees standing in that circle would have recited in synagogue, would have studied, would have known the way most people today know the words to songs they heard in childhood. Jeremiah's words were not obscure, they were canonical, and they contained a phrase so specific that, once you see it, the gesture in the courtyard becomes impossible to misread. The Lord is the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Written in the dust, not written in a book, not recorded in heaven. Written in the ground, the biblical image for a name that will not survive, a record that the next reign will erase, an identity that has chosen impermanence over the permanence of being known by God. In the theological world of Second Temple Judaism, to have your name written in the dust was the opposite of having it written in the book of life. It was the image of apostasy, of turning away, of choosing the wrong allegiance and having that choice registered in the most fragile medium possible. When Jesus bent down and wrote in the ground, he was not buying time. He was quoting Jeremiah with his body. The men standing in that circle, trained in Torah, fluent in the prophets, professionally devoted to the exact interpretation of texts, would have recognized what they were watching. A man writing names in the dirt, in the context of a legal accusation, in the temple courts. The symbolism was not subtle. It was a direct application of the most damning image in prophetic literature to the people who had brought this woman to be condemned. They had come to trap Jesus using the law. Jesus had just turned the law's most devastating verdict on them. And then there is a layer beneath even that, one that makes the gesture not merely symbolically devastating, but cosmically precise. Because the only other time in Scripture that the finger of God writes something, the stakes could not be higher. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. The finger of God wrote the law on stone, the law that the Pharisees were now wielding as a weapon against a woman who had violated it. And standing in that courtyard, the same finger, or so every gospel account implies, is writing again, not on stone this time. On ground, on earth, on dust. The contrast is not accidental. Stone endures. Dust does not. The law given on Sinai was written to last forever. The names being written in that courtyard on that morning were being written in the only medium that communicates impermanence. The medium the prophet had already designated for those who forsake the source of living water. The trap they had set was elegant. If Jesus said stone her, he would lose the crowds who followed him. If he said release her, he could be accused of contradicting Moses. It was designed to be inescapable. A perfect legal and political dilemma with no exit, and Jesus stepped out of it entirely by refusing to engage it on its own terms. He did not answer the question. He changed the frame. He transformed a trap about a woman into a judgment about the men who brought her. The moment he says it, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. The writing on the ground is no longer abstract. It is personal. Every man in that circle now understands that the names being written in the dust are theirs. Not hers, not because she is innocent, but because they are not the judges they believe themselves to be. And the text records what happens next with a quiet precision that is almost more devastating than anything else in the passage. The older ones leave first, which means the oldest men in the circle, the ones with the most years of accumulated religious authority, the most certainty about their own righteousness, understood what had just happened before the younger ones did. Experience had taught them enough about themselves to recognize the verdict. One by one they leave, until it is just Jesus and the woman. And he asks her, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" She says, "No one, Lord." And he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." That final exchange is often read as the emotional climax of the scene. The moment of grace, and it is, but it is grace that arrives only after a legal argument has been made and won. The woman is not released because the charge was dismissed. She is released because the only one in that courtyard qualified to cast the first stone chose not to. The one who bent down and wrote in the dust with the same finger that inscribed the law on Sinai stood up and declined to prosecute. What he wrote in the ground was an accusation, but the person he chose not to condemn was the one everyone expected him to condemn. That reversal is a thing worth sitting with. The gesture that looked like it was aimed at one person was aimed at everyone else, and the words that sounded like they might be condemnation turned out to be release. There is something else worth noticing in the silence that follows the writing. The text does not tell us what the words were. It does not give us a list of sins or names or specific charges. It gives us only the gesture and the reaction. And that restraint is itself a kind of argument, because if the specific content of what was written had been the point, the gospel writer would have recorded it. The point was not the content. The point was the act. The recognition on the part of men who lived by precise textual interpretation that they were watching a judgment being rendered. What was written mattered less than the fact that they understood what the writing meant. The message landed before the ink dried. There is a question buried in this story that almost no one asks directly, because it's uncomfortable. How many times have we stood in that circle, not with literal stones, but with verdicts already rendered, with positions already staked, with someone else's failure as the occasion for establishing our own righteousness? How many times has the thing we call justice been, if we're honest, a trap? Not for the person we're judging, but for the principles we claim to be defending. The men in that circle were not cartoons. They were educated. They were devout. They had spent their lives in the study of texts that commanded mercy. And they still arrived in that courtyard with stones. That is not a story about other people in another century. That is a description of a capacity that exists in human beings regardless of how much scripture they have memorized. The finger that wrote the law also wrote their names in the dust, and then stood up and offered the woman he was supposed to condemn the only two words that could have mattered: go free. If this changed how you see this scene, or if you know someone who has only ever heard the simple version, share it with them. The detail that most translations glide past is almost always the detail that changes everything, and there are more of them than anyone has told you.